Another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. This one I think is quite appropriate for the month of October with Halloween coming up, as I'm sure you're aware, at the end. So this topic is something that I first heard about quite a number of years ago. Didn't quite understand it at first. I don't think I fully grasped it yet. So that's kind of what we're kind of hoping to go with tonight. So I'm really glad to have Kyle Falcon on, who did his PhD on this subject. So he knows a lot about this stuff. So if you've got questions about things you've read or even stuff we're discussing, please fire away. So yeah, this is really going to be an open kind of chat. We're just going to talk generally about what this kind of means and then kind of go into some details that I was looking at this afternoon. So really excited to get this one going. Hey, Kyle, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for agreeing to come on. This is, like I said, this is an interesting topic. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what to believe. Like I just talked to you earlier. I think a healthy dose of skepticism and maybe a little bit of belief isn't a bad thing when it kind of comes to this stuff. But again, you're the expert. I'm not really sure. So I guess we'll just start kind of generally. So in your research, you talk about this sort of trend, and you can get into the details about how there was this, I don't even know what the right word to use is, I guess scientific study, because they believe themselves to be doing it in a scientific way, of studying ghosts and the paranormal and connections to people who had passed on and that kind of thing. So can you kind of explain what this research is? This, I already said I forget how to say it. This psychical, that's it, psychical study. What does that mean?
So before we get there, I mean, it's kind of helpful to kind of turn the clock back a little bit further to about the turn of the century, halfway through the 19th century, when essentially what happens is two young girls in Hydesville, New York, start manifesting these weird rapping sounds around them, these tapping sounds, and the family comes to believe that it's ghosts trying to communicate, and they start kind of asking it questions, and two taps would mean yes and one tap would mean no. You could go through the alphabet, A, B, C, D. A tap would mean the letter D, so you could ask the spirit his name, those types of things. And it kind of just they become local celebrities. And it's not the seance, there's examples of seances happening before that, but what really takes off after this kind of these two young girls become celebrities is the idea of communicating with the other world through some sort of medium, whether that be like a physical medium, like the first Ouija boards come around this time, or a human medium who kind of goes into trance and talks to spirits from the other world. And so it becomes this huge fad. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of a parlor game. There's lots of stories of Victorians, kind of just trying their hands at these talking boards or table turning, where you just use kind of a table and the table would move. And it just kind of became this kind of like, this little fun parlor game. But there was also people who took it very seriously and who believed that you could communicate with the other world quite literally. And it begins to attract the interests of scientists in around the 1870s. And I mean, there's lots of reasons why this is the case, but and one reason is the fact that the traditional churches are kind of losing their religious authority, losing their authority on things of theological importance or what are becoming of scientific interest. And, but there's also, it's kind of also just an interesting time when Europeans are building the first telegraph across the Atlantic, and then the first wireless telegraphs, and then the radio. And so there's kind of like this idea that maybe, if I can communicate with somebody, across the Atlantic, almost instantaneously, well, then, what maybe it's possible that, minds can communicate with other minds. Maybe the distance between this life and the next is just a communication problem. So it kind of opens, these scientific advancements kind of open up different possibilities. And so scientists kind of get interested in whether or not these table rappings, these seances, things like telepathy, whether or not they exist. And so in 1882, a group of intellectuals in Cambridge found the Society for Psychical Research, and it's dedicated to kind of testing these things and doing it with an open mind and kind of, seeing if there's any real good, solid evidence for these sorts of things. But they definitely kind of did have a bias. They were more likely to believe. They end up inventing the term telepathy, and that becomes kind of their pet project, one that they believe can be scientifically proven. The spiritualist thing, the seances, the table rapping, they're a bit more skeptical of that sort of stuff. They discover a lot of fraud. But that, in a nutshell, is kind of how you get to this point of psychical research.
Okay, cool. And you've done a number of blogs on this. I'll put those up after kind of talking about this subject. So one of them, and this is might be a little bit out of kind of what you have looked at, but you do mention the American Civil War and kind of how there's this. Well, it's a tourism industry built around visiting the battlefields, but with this sort of ghostly kind of ghost sightings and all these kind of different things that are connected to that. And I want to ask about something about that later, kind of for where you might see this going. But the time period you're talking about with the different inventions like the telegraph and how all that kind of comes out at that time period, is there a connection? Is there sort of a start, like an embryonic start maybe, with the American Civil War and kind of looking at this? Because again, the casualty levels of the American Civil War are huge, right, for the time. So it's I wouldn't be surprised, but again, is that kind of setting a little bit of a stage for future conflicts like the First World War? Yeah.
So I mean, there's two kind of real big blips in the history of
Sorry, I'm just gonna close my window. I got some
of course.
Surprise, it's crazy outside. You can keep going, Kyle.
Yeah. So there's two kind of real big blips in popularity and when it comes to spiritualism and psychical research. And I don't think it's any coincidence they both coincide with first the American Civil War and then the Great War. And there's a great book on death and mourning during the American Civil War by Drew Faust, called This Republic of Suffering. And she touches on this a little bit, but there needs to be more research on it. But yeah, there is an explosion of interest in this sort of stuff after the American Civil War. That's when you see the first spirit photographer who claims he can photograph spirits of the dead.
Right.
Mary Todd Lincoln visits him and claims to see the ghost of Abraham Lincoln after assassination. And it's, I just, one day I was kind of curious and I just did a Google Ngram search of the term spiritualism, and you can see there's a big spike right after the American Civil War, and then there's another huge spike in the 1920s. So the American Civil War is definitely kind of foreshadows what happens in the Great War, but there's a difference too. Okay. The scientific aspects of spiritualism really start to take off in the 1880s, and that's when the ghost becomes psychologized. Okay. So specters become, when debates about ghosts become debates about psychology and whether or not ghosts are really real, whether they're figments of the imagination. And then, of course, the Society for Psychical Research is founded in 1882, and their concept, telepathy, basically says ghosts aren't really spirits; they're telepathic messages. And so there's this drive to kind of psychologize the ghost rather than kind of the more traditional ghosts. And so this has an impact on what happens in the Great War, because a lot of the debates get kind of caught up in that question of psychology and whether or not these things are telepathic or whether or not they're real spirits. And what I argue in my book I'm working on right now and in my PhD dissertation is that after the First World War, it's a Pyrrhic victory for Britain. It's, there's that sense of whether or not it was really worth the sacrifice of 900,000 dead across the British Empire. And so some people latch on to this idea that, well, at least it proved the existence of the afterlife or the existence of spirits. And so a lot of people get caught up in the psychical research aspect, trying to prove these things precisely because it kind of redeems the dead in a sense. So that's kind of what I would say is the big difference.
Yeah.
First World War.
Yeah, and that comes through right in these blog posts that you sent to me, and then I was reading today again, which there's so many stories that like I said on Twitter earlier, like just like fascinating. That and the name that kept coming up, and I wonder if you can talk about him a little bit, is Lodge. He loses a son, and I wonder if you could just talk about kind of his role in all of this.
Yeah, so I mean, Lodge is one of kind of the first psychical researchers. He's connected with the Society for Psychical Research. I'm just going to call it the SPR for the rest of the night because that'll be a lot easier. But he's connected with the SPR early on. So he doesn't turn to spiritualism per se because of the war.
Right.
He's interested in these sorts of things, but he is definitely less skeptical of the spiritualist hypothesis after the war. And before the war, he approaches it. He's a physicist. I should say that he discovers Hertzian waves before Marconi does. He's the real deal. He's a real scientist. He's an award-winning scientist, member of the Royal Society, and he's interested in psychical research from an early stage. And then his son Raymond dies near Ypres in 1915, and over time, Lodge becomes more open to and interested in spiritualism rather than just psychical research. And he goes to a few mediums and begins getting messages that he believes are proof that his son has survived in the spirit world. And then he writes this book, which outlines the arguments for why he came to this conclusion. And it sells. It goes through, I think, 12 reprints before the end of the war. So it's a big deal. There's some of the soldiers kind of read it. There's some evidence of that. I think Tim Cook has a great article, and I'm envious of the story that he uncovered because it's one of those things I was kind of looking for in the archives for hours on end in London, and he finds this example of these soldiers who, after reading Raymond, decide to try and test whether or not they have telepathic powers. But where it really takes off is with those who are also mourning. People who have mothers mostly who have lost a son really gravitate towards Raymond. It launches kind of a bunch of copycats. I mean, probably about a dozen similar books come out inspired by Oliver Lodge's Raymond. And so it kind of gives people an in to spiritualism, and people who want to try it for themselves might go to a medium or a fortune teller, or might pick up a Ouija board, might try something called automatic writing, where you basically go into trance and let the spirits kind of take over your hand. So he kind of makes it, his public advocacy and his public outing as a spiritualist kind of makes it comfortable for other people to kind of try these things as well.
Right, and I get that sense because you talk about the book Raymond, and I was wondering, because again I just have such limited time, if you could kind of, you said it outlines this argument. Can you just go into what the book actually argues or how it goes about that?
Yeah, so I mean, one big piece of evidence is he's at a seance with the famous medium Gladys Osborne Leonard in Britain, and the medium makes mention of a photograph and gives details about the photograph. It's I can't remember the details exactly, but it's something like he's standing in front of, it's a group photograph. He's on his knees. Somebody has their shoulder over, or their elbow over his shoulder, and a few other details. And they said, well, there's no photo like that. We haven't seen a photo like that. Right. And so they start inquiring with some of his comrades and some of his friends. And sure enough, someone sends them a photo and it's that exact description. And then the second line of evidence is, oh shoot, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's something that only Oliver Lodge and Raymond knew, and so it's things like that,
right?
That kind of convinces him. But I mean, again, the seeds were sowed early, right? I mean,
right.
Sir Oliver Lodge is into some pretty weird things before the outbreak of the war, and so he's kind of conditioned to believe in these sorts of things, and then the war is kind of what really tips it.
Right, and that kind of, again, I mean, it makes sense if you're predisposed to thinking in certain ways, right? If you're going to have such a traumatic event like losing a son, it's not unsurprising. Is that, again, maybe I'm just asking to generalize, and you might not even know, but is that kind of your sense of people who followed this kind of thinking? Was that the ones that you've seen? Like, did they kind of believe in this stuff before, or was it the war that like transformed their thoughts into this? Because I do want to get to this, because you mentioned a soldier who was very involved in this, but has a different ending. But I'm just kind of wondering, is that more of those are like kind of one-offs, or is there something else here?
I mean, it's a bit of a mixed bag, and so that's a difficult question, and you have to be careful, because there's a tendency to say, well, to just chalk it only up to, well, they just wanted to believe in that because that made them feel good, right?
Right.
And certainly there's something to that, but we do have to be careful. It is a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced than that, right? Not everybody believed in this stuff. Not everybody who lost somebody believed in these sorts of things. You have the people like Lodge who are preconditioned. Conan Doyle, of course, another huge name at this time.
Right.
He, didn't come out as a spiritualist until the war, but again, he was kind of interested in it before the war.
Right.
But then you have the people who are Christians, were raised Christian, who lose somebody in the war, go to their church, and then don't like the answers or lack thereof that they get from the church. And so they try their hand at spiritualism and become convinced. And then there are some people who, try their hand at it and come away going, this is foolish. So it really is a mixed bag. One thing I'm struck by, though, is, and this is why I say you kind of have to be careful about, just talking it all up to a will to believe, is in a lot of these testimonies, you see these people kind of struggling with what they're witnessing, or, saying like, I don't want to believe too easily, like kind of, demanding good proof.
Right.
There is a lot of that, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of kind of carefulness. There are people who are like, well, this would be great if it was true, but I'm going to need some proof.
Right.
And so it really is a mixed bag. Like it really depends on the individual, but I would just say you have to be careful about jumping too quickly to, well, they just want to believe because it's a nice thing to believe.
Yeah, and of course I want to avoid generalizations, but it just, in what I've read from what you provided and from when you're talking, whatever that was years ago, and just kind of thinking about this, because, and this is connected to grief, right? You can't dismiss that as well. I'm not saying, like you said, that's not what brings everybody in, right? And that's where the soldier, I forget his name, Dudley, maybe? No, that's not right. Something, anyway. You wrote a blog post about him, and I think that's really interesting, because it's really telling. Yeah, I forget his name.
Oh, James Doody was his name.
Doody, that's it. A bit of a busy day for me. That's it. I got the D. That was close enough. Because I wonder if you could talk about his story too, because
sure,
to me, it's interesting. And again, I'll put these up later. As soon as we're done, I'll put them back up. I had some issues with it deleting itself or something. It has a medical component, which I think is quite interesting in his story. And again, it's kind of not saying one thing or the other, and not trying to generalize, but it does connect to the medical community in his story. And I think if you could just kind of give a rundown on that, I think it's enlightening in a different way.
Yeah. So, I mean, his story always interested me, because while I was working on one of my chapters for my dissertation, I was trying to track down as many spiritualist soldiers as I could. And I should preface this by saying spiritualism could be a hobby, like I was saying, like a parlor game, or somebody just picking up a Ouija board. But it was also an organized religious movement.
Right.
So there were spiritualist churches, and there's some that still exist today. And so some people would actually self-identify as a capital S spiritualist, and they would go to those church, and there would be services with a psychic, and you would get to meet and mingle with like-minded people. And for some people that that coexisted with their Christian beliefs as well. Right. But anyway, so I found his story because I was looking for as many of these spiritual soldiers as possible, because I was curious if any had left behind any records of their battlefield experiences, how those beliefs shaped their time on the front lines, and how they understood everything on the battlefield. And his was one of those stories that I just found really interesting, but that I couldn't really fit into my dissertation, and it wasn't really enough to write a peer-reviewed article. So I decided I'd write a blog article about it. But what interests me about his case was he ends up being diagnosed as mad. And that set off a red flag, because especially in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, there was this overlap between his madness and spiritualism. Right. So some people who were diagnosed as mad were also interested in spiritualism, women especially. Right. In France, neurologists like Pierre Genet study hysterical women who also claim to be mediums, and so they chalk it up to hysteria. Right. And so immediately that set off a red flag, and I wanted to look at his story more. And it turns out he had a perfectly good reason for being labeled mad. It wasn't because of his spiritualism; it was because he had neurosyphilis. Yeah. Which does horrible things to the brain. Mm-hmm. But what I did find interesting was in his records, there was no mention of his interest in spooks or interest in spiritualism. Right. And you can't say too much about a single case like that. But it made me wonder. We knew he was spiritualist because he identified as a spiritualist. He went to a spiritualist church, and he wrote to some spiritualist journals. That's how I knew he was a spiritualist. Mm-hmm. And he was a spiritualist before the war. But when they mentioned how kind of he had these grandiose ideas and these self-importance, it had nothing to do with spiritualism. And that makes me wonder, was he just not saying anything about it, or were they just not really interested in it? And I wonder if spiritualism was more acceptable after the war or during the war because of its kind of public profile within the medical community. I mean, again, you can't really say anything with certainty because sources just aren't there, but it's an interesting case study, kind of. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's why I wanted to talk about that, because I think it's just an interesting case study, because you've got multiple threads going on there. You've got the medical issues surrounding sexually transmitted infections and what that means to the Canadian Corps. He was in the Canadian Corps. He was in the CEF. Yeah. Those of us who know or have done any digging know that was a major problem for the Canadian Corps, keeping men in the field. They had huge problems with that. So, and then also, like you said, the horrible things that syphilis does to the human brain when it's allowed to get to that point. Mm-hmm. It's just so interesting how this connects. And then too, you highlight that this kind of grandiose ideas that he had. I think he said he was going to be like the greatest grocer in the country or something. Yeah. Like he has no idea what any of that means, right? So is that them ignoring him? Is that him, just his brain literally, attacking itself? Is this something more? I don't know. Is that something that somebody told him through a medium or through his own beliefs? Again, we don't know, and I don't think we're ever gonna know. Mm-hmm. But I think why I think this topic is so interesting is, and this might be kind of a letdown to some viewers, but there's no answers to some of this stuff, and we're just not going to have that. All we can try to understand is the place that this had in certain people's thinking, and how that kind of proceeded. And I do want to talk about Will Burr, because I think it's unavoidable. because Canadian military history, it's in the title of the channel. So he's a big figure well outside any of this topic that we're talking about today, right? He's well known for the First World War, for his own exploits, his own memoirs that you and me were just talking about before, but also what he does in the Second World War. And he writes books for units after the war and continues writing. He's an unavoidable figure. And for those who might not know, I'm hoping, Kyle, I can get you to kind of explain his connection to this, or supposed connection to this. And I think, the title of his memoir is very telling in that area.
Yeah. So Will R. Bird is what got me into this topic in the first place. But I should just make note that, just because somebody believes in ghosts, or just because somebody had a ghostly experience, does not make them a spiritualist, right? I mean, right. There's no evidence that Will Bird ever went to a medium, ever used a Ouija board. Mm-hmm. But if you go back to his previous memoir, his original memoir, which I think is a much better memoir for many reasons, and we can get into that if you want. But he wrote a memoir in 1930 called "And We Go On," and it was kind of, not necessarily lost, but kind of went out of print, and people just kind of forgot about it until it got republished recently. And if you go through that one, there are clear signs that he is writing this book in 1930, when spiritualism is kind of this public fad in the 1920s, when Arthur Conan Doyle is coming to Canada, going to the United States, going to Australia, giving these lectures on spiritualism, talking about spiritualism. Spiritualism is in the news. Maybe your neighbor tried their hand at a Ouija board. Maybe you know somebody who went to a medium. Spiritualism is in the air. It's public knowledge in the 1920s. And you can see that influence in "And We Go On." I mean, there's a point where he has a relationship with a medium on the British Isles while he's on leave. Right. So it's there. It's not in Ghosts Have Warm Hands, but it's there and "And We Go On." And what is interesting about these two books is "And We Go On" is littered with strange psychical experiences. Yeah. There's premonitions. Premonitions are one of the major themes of the book. It's one of these ongoing kind of stories. Right. He feels his brother's ghost on multiple occasions, rather than just those two times in Ghosts Have Warm Hands. Right. But what really, so he erases these when he's writing his book in 1968. Mm-hmm. He leaves that one ghost story, pretty much, I think maybe two. But everything else is kind of removed. And it's this weird book because it's such a realist depiction of the war, and people love it for that reason. I mean, it's a terrific memoir. Right. But then you just have kind of this ghost story crammed in it, and it kind of seems out of place. But when you go back to "And We Go On," I mean, it's just an entire. It's the whole point of the book, is to show that these kind of things are real, and that they can be proven. Right. But what really strikes me, what's interesting about "When We Go On," is Ghosts Have Warm Hands. His brother pulls him out of the shelter that he's staying in, and he says he feels his warm hand, and it sticks with him after the fact. If you go into "And We Go On," that's not there. Right. And that's not an accident, because the only sort of physical contact that's even hinted at is he mentions that he wakes up from a dream and he feels a tug at his arm. Right. And that's really significant, because, and then his brother kind of motions him to go somewhere. He doesn't pull him out. He doesn't grab his hand. And that's significant because "And We Go On" is there's this theme throughout it of, is this stuff a product of the mind, or is this stuff real? Right. And that is deliberate, because he's writing in a time when, as I said, the ghost has become psychologized. So right. There's a reason why the ghost isn't pulling him out of the shelter. So Will Bird knows his audience. He's a prolific writer. He's a very talented writer. And he knows which audience he's writing to. And in the 1930, he knows that there is this kind of spiritualist craze, this psychical research craze. And I would argue that he's writing towards that audience.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part to remember. We had a comment in the sidebar here in the chat about how he was a journalist, and he clearly knew what to do to get people's attention. I mean,
yeah, I think he wrote like 600 short stories or something like that throughout his life. Yeah,
he wrote a lot. I mean, he comes up, like when I was kind of talking about introducing the topic, he comes up in the strangest places, and he's always just kind of around, and he's just always writing something for somebody, connected to someone, both wars. I mean, after the fact, because I'm not too sure. I don't think he wrote too much during the First World War. If for my
that's when he found his writing.
Yeah. So he clearly had that undescribable factor of being a good writer. He clearly had that, but he knew what he was doing. So, like you said, and like I've said before, I'm not making fun of this belief. Again, I don't know. I honestly, after hearing your first presentation, I go, I don't even know what to believe anymore with how this all connects and what's going on. And I honestly I don't know. I'm not making fun, or of anyone, because I don't know. I don't claim to know. It's just there's got to be something there, or there's got to be a reason why people are going to this depth in it. I mean, yeah, there's going to be some true believers. There's going to be skeptics who are just trying to prove a point or not prove a point or what have you. But again, that's why I think Will Bird is so interesting, is because, like you said, there's the two memoirs, and then he's kind of mythologized again in Pierre Burton's work, because he left writings behind, and Burton was trying to go for that kind of narrative of, the heroic Canadian kind of thing. So like that's how I first learned about Will Bird was through Vimy. So when I heard about his memoir and all that stuff, I'm like, sounds like an interesting man, but also how that this all connects. And to me, it's so interesting. Like, I wish there was more out here. Like, I hear stories and I hear things, and no one, as far as I know, it's not popularly or in, I don't know, I want to say mainstream academic writings, unless I've missed stuff and of more of this, but I don't know enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I read Will Bird's and we or Ghosts Have Warm Hands in 2008 for the first time in an undergraduate classroom. And now I'm just realizing how long ago that was.
Yeah, I'm the same. Yeah,
getting old. But
yeah, we're getting there.
Yeah, I wanted to do my master's on the subject, and then I kind of was skittish about it because I was worried that people wouldn't take me seriously. But after I did my master's and I wanted to do a PhD, I just kept coming back to that. Sorry, I'm just reading that comment. And
yeah. Go ahead. All right, I just keep popping up.
No, that's fine. But sorry, what was I saying? Oh, right. But I realized that there's lots written on the supernatural, on spiritualism, on psychic research from historians, and a lot of good stuff too. But when you were talking, I was just kind of remembered of something. I mean, one huge thing about the Great War, if not the biggest thing when it comes to death and mourning, is the number of missing. Mm-hmm. Steve Bird, Will Bird's brother, goes missing. His body is never found. And so when Will Bird first sees him, he thinks, you're alive. Why haven't you told anyone that you're alive? Where have you been this whole time? And the big thing for me is, and this is a major theme of my book that I'm just trying to finish, is that, between 1914 and 1918, 900,000 men in the British Empire are killed. Mm. Half of those have no known grave. Yep. And half of those have literally no body. Right, so there's 250,000 or so unknown graves in the cemeteries in France and Belgium and elsewhere. Yeah. But then there's another 200 or so thousand bodies that are just gone. Yeah. And so that's what that does to a society. I mean, I can't even really comprehend that. Right. Right. 450 50,000 men just from the British Empire alone going missing in 4 years. Their bodies literally gone. I think Jay Winter calls it, the Great War of Vanishing Act. And so that shocks people, and the memory of the dead and the questions about what happened to them and whether or not they might even still be alive.
Right.
I mean, Britain and the British Empire is literally haunted, right? And so that's, a really major current underneath this kind of need to kind of get these cosmic answers, or to look to the spiritual for some sort of answers.
Right.
People are, literally haunted by the dead during this time.
And I think, I think you're bang on with the scale of the missing. I mean, when you even the numbers are literally, they're in, I don't know, they're under, it's hard to comprehend in today's society what that means. Just imagine whole cities just gone. You never see their bodies again. That's the scale that we're talking about here. But I think this is connected, because this to me is connected to memory and commemoration, because again, that's a complicated topic in and of itself. But you're right with it, and I'm just trying to think about those literally scale, because that's what keeps coming in my head when you mention those numbers. If you think about the memorials to the missing, they're literally massive. Vimy, massive. The Menin Gate is huge. Thiepval is massive. You can see that thing for miles.
Yeah.
On even a crappy day, because I've been there on a crappy day. You could still see it sticking out. So to me, that's got to represent something. That's such a scar on the psyche, a collective psyche. But when that gets to the individual level, and to the families, right, that are left, it makes sense. Again, that they're trying to comprehend it, I guess, is maybe the best word. I don't know if you even can. It's just an interesting thing, and I don't know if you've explored that at all. Like you said, you're working on the book, and we got a really nice comment, and I kind of agree. Get that thing done.
I'm working on it.
No pressure or anything, but hey, it's already. But you know what I mean? It's something that I don't think can be ignored, and I think that there's connections here to so many different areas.
One kind of quote that always struck out to me I was reading a transcript in the seance, and the spirit in the seance basically said, the number of men going over to the other side brought the two worlds, the spirit world and the earthly world, closer together. And I think that's kind of an apt metaphor. When you have all these men dying so quickly, and half of them literally vanishing,
right?
And these people are mourning and grieving and thinking about the dead. This idea that the two worlds, the spiritual world and the physical world, are closer together, almost like the veil has been lifted. I think that's an important insight to understanding what these people went through. And it's something that is, I would argue, is quite familiar to us in some ways, in the way we commemorate and remember the Great War. I think about some of the rituals or some of the monuments, this idea that the dead are present but also absent, is something I've felt when I've walked the old front lines and looked at and visited these memorials.
Right.
And so I think it's we may not believe in ghosts. You may believe in ghosts, you may not, but there's a connection there. That binds the past and the present together. We're closer to some of these beliefs, I think, than we're willing to acknowledge, even if they come across as secular.
Right, and I think that's why it's so interesting to me, and there's these connections. So there's an area I want to get to. We had a question that was a really good one. We'll get to it in a second. But I there was the last story, the one of the blogs, and you kind of hinted at it a little bit. This idea of crossing, I guess crossing over is a common term used for it, right? Moving on to the spiritual world or what have you, whatever you believe. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this a little more. Is the one story is the son is I don't think it might have been Lodge's son, I can't remember, saying he's helping the others to cross over, and you use that in the framework of sacrifice, right? Because as a good number of us know, during the war, it's seen as the noble sacrifice, or Jonathan Vance he's used death so noble, which is so perfect for how to understand it. And then that changes after the war, moving into the 20s and 30s, about how it's a pointless war and there's no point to all this death because another one comes. But I was just wondering if there's maybe a little more to that, trying to find, not necessarily still have necessarily a connection, but an understanding of why they were killed. If there's more to it other than things like nationalism or what have you. Because again, that's sticking with me, saying his purpose is to help his fellow soldiers move on to a state he had just entered himself. It's just, to me, it's such an interesting way of whether, if you want to move, complete logic and just say this is the way he dealt with the grief, or if it's true that maybe that was his purpose. Again, I don't know. I was wondering if you had a little more on that or not. Again, I'll put these blogs up after because I got so engrossed in them. I lost track of time. Like, it's just so interesting to me. But I was just wondering if there's a little bit more there possibly, or there's going to be in the book and then we'll stop talking about it. But
yeah, no, I'm happy to tease what the book will be like. But yeah, I mean, there's a huge lost generation thing going on here. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's I think it's, Jay Winter who says, like the modernist literature, the disillusioned stuff by Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and Robert Graves. Right. That stuff makes for great literature, but imagine telling someone that your son died for nothing, right? It's not very comforting. Right. So what you see in kind of the spiritualist movement and during this time is that the soldiers essentially are still alive on the other side, and they're still doing things that are significant and important, right? It's important to remember that although in terms of the aggregate number of dead, the working class suffer more, in terms of the proportion of the population, the middle and upper classes, the social and cultural elite, they suffer disproportionately. And so these parents, especially, who had these great hopes for these young, gifted, intelligent men to pass on the family name, to do great things in the world, that's extinguished. And the reasons for going to war in 1914, things change once the body count really rises.
Right.
And so it would be inaccurate to say people suddenly were all disillusioned and didn't believe in the war's sacrifices.
Right.
That's wrong. That really only takes off around 1929, 1930. And even then, it's only one competing memory of the war. And
it's sorry, a bit of jump in here a little bit. But again, it's also not, these things are hard to track, but it's not even the majority opinion, right? Because I've heard that as well. Like, because you said, these are the elite of society, the Robert Graves and those who survive, right? It's their opinion. It's not everyone's opinion.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's something I always like to keep in mind with the First World War, because I hear that a lot.
Yeah. Sure, and that was Jay Winter's great insight with Sights of Memory, Sights of Mourning, right? Spiritualism was one way in which people found meaning and imbued sacrifice with meaning.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to think about it in that sense. And also too, I was listening to a guest who's coming on the show tomorrow, Paul Reed, was talking about the epitaphs on the actual gravestones and kind of what that means. And one, I can't remember the exact wording. I wish I should have wrote it down, but I didn't. Is about how, again, we don't know the story behind most of them. Was about something about keeping England free of weeds, and I think that's interesting because I think it connects to what you said. The cream, supposed cream, rising to the top of society is cut off. Like, there are huge numbers of them are killed. It could be part of that too. I mean, this seems like something, again, I don't know, maybe this will get into the book. Maybe there is a class element here. I don't know. I'm not sure if this is like maybe more towards the middle upper classes of society do this. I mean, that's the only ones I know who are writing about that. I'm not saying they're the ones who are. But I mean, that's just the readings that I know are out there. But again, maybe that can be something your book later can talk about, or you've already looked at that. I'm not sure, but
yeah, there's a huge class element. I mean, Owen Davies has a great book out called Supernatural War, and he makes the excellent and important point that spiritualism was more of a middle and upper class thing, and what was more kind of popular was people going to fortune tellers, people who tell your fortune.
Yeah.
That was kind of the more plebeian approach to this.
Right.
Whereas, the kind of sophisticated spiritualism or the organized spiritualism, I mean, there were working class spiritualists, but a lot of that was coming from the middle class.
Right. And then, I mean, that's the sense you get just from reading things you've done or hearing about this stuff. I mean, Conan Doyle is probably the biggest name connected to this, and he's by no means slumming it in the mills of Manchester or something. Like not even close. So that's just kind of a thought I had. Is it's something to remember because class studies of the First World War are well, they're kind of ubiquitous now, but they're also important to keep in mind, and I think that's something to keep in mind. So we kind of come back because this is a good question. And I said we'd come back for Matt here. So, and I don't think it's off topic because you've written this on yourself about this, how the Civil War battlefields, the American Civil War battlefields are supposed sites of, I don't know how many ghost sightings. You mentioned it's a lot, and there's tons of that happening. I've heard it myself. I've been to a few, heard the stories. Like, I mean, I've been to the Arlington National Cemetery, and descriptions from people I know who don't believe in this kind of thing any way, shape, or form are like, you can feel the ghosts in Arlington. You can feel the ghosts at Gettysburg. When you go to like St. Julian or, Hill 145 at Vimy, some people say that, but not really. I don't hear that very often. You don't really hear, or there's ghost stories, ghosts in the mist in the morning or something. And I was wondering, again, you talk about this in the blog. I just wonder if you can, for the audience, talk about why you think that is.
So, short answer, I don't know.
Other than that, yeah,
no, it's something I've always wondered, and it is weird why
it's
that same
out there
culture doesn't exist in I think, and this is just me riffing on some ideas.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I wanted to say this is just.
Yeah.
This is your opinion, speculation. We're not saying the answer, but
yeah, I'm happy to be challenged and proven wrong on this.
Yeah.
And
all of us are. I mean, we should.
Yeah, I mean, part of it might be the American capitalist culture. Part of it might be that the United States hasn't really grappled with its past, with slavery. The American Civil War has really been whitewashed. We all know that. I mean, just in the recent debates about Confederate monuments and that sort of stuff, and all that politics that's going down in the States. And so I think it's easier to commodify the American Civil War.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
I think too. I mean, those would be, I think, my biggest guess. I think if somebody started selling ghost books about, or trying to do ghost tours on the former battlefields of the First World War and the cemeteries of the First World War, I think there would be, more of this is sacred ground. This isn't appropriate. And so I think that speaks to how large the Great War still looms in Europe and Canada, the British Commonwealth. Whereas in the American Civil War, I think there's just greater opportunity for that exploitation. And again, I'm happy to be proven wrong about that, but I think too, the rituals and the monuments are more matured, and again, happy to be proven wrong.
Right.
In on the former battlefields of the First World War.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something there, because you also mentioned like ghost tours of different historic sites, that kind of thing. And you talk about that, how it's not prevalent for the First World War. And I mean, we're going to see a lot of that coming up for this month, especially. You're going to, those of us interested in history, it's going to be unavoidable. All these different places that are like not even connected to any of this stuff any other time are going to be like, we're going to do this, or we're going to have a haunted this, or, you know, that kind of thing. And again, I don't blame most of them because they're small institutions who need the cash. I mean, I get it. I have no problem with it. But, and again, I don't know how to say this. I don't necessarily would have an issue with the First World War having this kind of, yeah, it's a commodification, and I don't like that with the battlefields and the cemeteries. But I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but because maybe I'm used to the American context where it's been around for a long time. That's nothing new. And you see that in American culture as well. I mean, Salem is still hugely popular, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on there. But like I said, like I've been to some of these Civil War battlefields, been to Arlington. It's a bit of a different vibe, I guess, is the best way to describe it. I don't know. I don't know if it's because it's a closer generation, right? First World War, like my great grandfather was a First World War soldier. I mean, I never met him. He died just before I was born, but I knew people who told me all kinds of stories, right? So it feels closer. Whereas I don't know if the American Civil War is far back enough for this, or it's the things you talk about, right? Again, I'm not trying to like a bit of a devil's advocate, right? Is it just because it's so far away? Is that going to happen with the First World War? I mean, yeah, what's your opinion? Do you think that could happen with the First World War sites?
Maybe. It could be time, but I'm not sure if I'm convinced that's what's going on because, you know, I use the example of ghost stories of mental asylums, right?
Yeah, right.
You know, that's not that far away.
That's true.
Yeah. And you know, still lots of people in the States still have kind of these family ties to the Civil War history.
True.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible, right? You know, over time, these things could happen with the First World War. But again, like just the scars on the landscape in the First World War, right? It still feels, when you're there, it still feels very close.
Right.
So I don't know. It's possible. It's entirely possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like the literal scars are everywhere when you go to these places. They're unavoidable, right? Like, I mean, I posted today about how behind the Canadian War Museum, they've kind of done a commemoration of Beaumont Hamel by trying to make the ground literally look like it looks like at Beaumont Hamel. And that was at that point they put it in. It was like 90 years,
right,
ago. So I think it's just an interesting way. Now, I am going to ask, you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Do you think that there's an element to this that is just grief, not being able to handle grief, or this is the way that they handled it? Is that a big part? Is that a small part? Again, you don't have to even answer in direct if you don't want to, because I don't want to put you in a corner by any means. But I just want to, because you study this, right, more than any of us. So I just kind of want your thoughts on, could this have another motivation that people might not even be aware of that they were going through?
Well, I mean, grief is definitely the driving force, right? It's a driving force with spiritualism early on, before the First World War. Grief is a huge component, right? It's what brings a lot of people in. But there's other things going on. One is just curiosity. One is, this is fun. One is, well, might as well try my hand at it. Who knows what happens, right?
Okay, yeah.
But spiritualism is also, there's huge gender dynamics, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason why most mediums were women, and that's because it gave them an opportunity for having some sort of spiritual or scientific authority, and so it's attracting to certain middle class women who are you kind of restrained by, especially in the Victorian period, by Victorian gender norms, and it gives them an opportunity to be spiritually and scientifically authoritative. There's also a sexual component. Women could act promiscuous and say, it's not my fault, spirit took over my body. Yeah. They could act masculine. Again, it's not me, it's a masculine spirit speaking through me. Yeah, so there's lots of reasons why people go to spiritualism, and but after the First World War, I mean, definitely the driving force is grief, for sure.
Yeah, and I keep coming back to that because again, the grief is still palpable. I mean, I've been there myself. Like I did, I went to, I think it was Ontario Cemetery, outside Canal du Nord, where one of the first division went through. I knew some of these people from studying them. I didn't know them, no family connection, nothing like that. And I broke down, and I was just like, I can't control it. So it's just there is this element here that grief is still there, and that's why I think this topic is important to understand. Again, I'm not saying one way or the other is the right way. To me, it's just such an interesting case story in how we think about grief and even religion and our own understanding of ourselves. And I think it's well worth the study of this. And so I think what you're doing is good. I'm going to go off Norma again and say, yeah, get this book done because I want to read more. I want to read it and get into this because I think it's important. Now, I didn't want to ask this, but we got a few minutes left. I can't stop thinking about it. And I think you know where I might be going with this is Mackenzie King. A huge figure in Canadian history, known spiritualist. If you've never done anything with it, just tell me to shut up about it and we'll end it. But I was just wondering if you've come across maybe, his thinking, or if he wasn't, really influenced by this from the First World War, because again, those diaries, they're a wild ride when you're looking at them. I don't know if you've come across anything like that, or in a pure Canadian context with him. I mean, again, I don't know too much. I just know the diaries really well because I've gone through them a lot. But I just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, if this is, connection to the First World War. Is it King just being the kooky dude that he was? I don't know. Again, if you don't have an answer, that's good too.
I think, the First World War is there in the sense that it's almost impossible to talk about spiritualism in the in the interwar period in which King is operating without mentioning the Great War and what it does for its popularity, its public profile. It's Conan Doyle's, it's Oliver Lodge's. I mean, so I'm not an expert on King, but it's all part of the context, right?
Right.
So what motivated King to go down that road is a different question. But I mean, the Great War is there in the sense that it shapes the popularity and the publicity of this sort of thing in the interwar period. And I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong, and if I am, my apologies, but I'm pretty sure he mentions Oliver Lodge on occasion in those diaries. Yeah. So, I mean, it's there. What specifically motivated him personally is another question. But I mean, what I would say is, that's a good example of how context matters, right? I mean, let's say for argument's sake that King would have been interested in this, in the supernatural and in signs and in omens and in visions and all that sort of stuff, whether or not spiritualism existed. It would have looked, the specifics, kind of like, the flavor of his writing and his practices would have looked different. But, these things are timeless, right?
That's fair.
Beliefs in the supernatural, beliefs in ghosts, beliefs in mind-to-mind communication, belief in magic, that transcends culture and time. But in different, in different places and in different times, these things, the closer you look, they get specific. And so what I would say is that King, whatever traits of his personality or whatever interests he had in the supernatural, he's still operating in this context of the interwar period, and that's really shaped a lot by the First World War.
Yeah, I get what you're saying here. It might not be the thing, the driver, but it's in the car, I guess.
It's there. You have to talk about it, right?
You can't not, right? Yeah, it's a really interesting way to think about it. Yeah, sort of putting you on the spot a little bit there because I know that's interwar.
No. It's something I've thought about. I've never really.
Yeah, I mean, I can't stop thinking about it either because it was a big part of my own work. I mean, King's motivations for doing all kinds of things was part of my work, and the First World War is the context that he does everything in. So I was like, well, why not the spiritualism, right? It literally decides when he's going to do to stop, conscription in any way, shape, or form. why couldn't he be influenced by that? And we have another good question. I think this will be the last one because I think it's a good question. And if you don't know, that's fine. Or you want to save it for the book, I'm happy with that answer too. But about the French and the Belgian people who live there now or in the past, have you come across anything unusual from them, what they think, what they have experienced?
So not me personally. I mean, that's something I've always thought about. Doing some sort of kind of anthropological study on this and or oral history and interviewing people in France and Belgium, whether or not they've heard any ghost stories. I mean, I haven't looked in a while, but I did tons of digging online to see. I can't find anything. But my French isn't great. And I've never interviewed anyone about it in France or Belgium. So, I mean, it's an open question. I mean, I would be interested to know too, because I do find it odd that, there is this weird contrast between the American Civil War and the First World War. I mean, why they hasn't bred more ghost stories, I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and well, Second World War comes to my mind is because of the context is very rich. Right. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily because of the Canadian element, but because if you are inclined to these beliefs, Very Ridge is literally now has houses on it. People, it's like looks like a little suburb now. Mm-hmm. They're right there. So if this is going to happen, they're going to notice because they're right there. I'm sure you've been there yourself. The farm field is right there where the slaughter of the Black Watch happened. Mm-hmm. It's just. If it's going to happen, you think it's got to be there. It's got to be there. Or I don't know. Again, I don't know.
Well, this is what's interesting because, you think about, the fact that so many missing, right? Like literally vanished bodies would kind of create this, as I've already said, it creates this idea that the world is haunted in the 1920s, 1930s. But I wonder if because there was such an effort to commemorate the missing, if there's less, if that kind of dulls the context or, it kind of goes back to my point I was saying earlier about there being those appropriate commemorations and rituals that maybe there's less of an opening for ghost stories in that sense.
It's distinctly possible. I mean,
I don't know.
Commemoration is a tricky issue. You say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and it can open a can of worms. So it's interesting, but I think that would be cool talking about people or just oral histories of them, even if it doesn't take this sort of spiritual or slant, just what it's like, living by a battlefield. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's lots of things you could definitely do with that. Yeah. But so this was a really good.
There's got to be
something
ghost stories. Yeah. I mean, a lot of this is like folk. That's the nature of folklore, right?
Yeah.
That it's not really something that's easy to trace or really put into writing until somebody kind of records an oral testimony, right?
Like tries to specifically do that.
Yeah. So I mean, these things could be out there, people talking about it. Oh, I saw something strange or heard something strange last night near the old battlefields. I mean, it's entirely possible. It just hasn't been commodified into this ghostly tourism thing because enough people thinks that that's inappropriate to do on these former grounds.
Well, an idea just popped in my head. Napoleonic battlefields. Why hasn't it happened there? Mm-hmm. And commercialized to death. Mm-hmm. So why isn't it happening there? I mean, those battles were huge for the time. Still are huge numbers today. Even 100,000 men slogging away at each other. I mean, again, if it's going to happen,
the answer must have to do with American culture. I think
it does. I think you're right. I mean, again, not saying we're experts, but I think you're right. Yeah. So I think that's a good place to end. I think this is a good topic, like I was already saying. And I think you got some interested readers who are going to be waiting. So, can you give you a little extra push? When you don't have one, just back of your mind. I got my Brad's YouTube viewers are like, let's get this thing done. But anyway, I would love to have you back on when it is finished and I get a chance to go through it. That would be
great.
Because again, I'm going to be buzzing about this topic probably for a while now. It's not going to be good. It's like I got to get out of my head for a bit. But I'm just going to do a quick sign off and then we'll come say goodbye.
Okay.
So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Kyle clearly knows us lots about this stuff. Hopefully we'll get him back on when the book is done, whenever that may be. So looking forward to that and learning more about this. So we got another show coming up tomorrow. It's at 2 p.m. Eastern time, which I believe is 7 p.m. UK time, about Corselet with Paul Reed, who really knows his stuff. The pictures alone are going to be worth watching for what he's done. I mean, literally talking decades of experience here with Paul Reed. Knowledgeable, great guy. So I'm really looking forward to that. Check that out. If you really like what you're seeing here and the different shows and the different topics that I'm now bringing you multiple in a week, please consider supporting me and the channel through Patreon. I know a few of you watching already are, so thank you so much. I need some more support to keep this going. I can't do it without it. I won't be able to keep this up. So please do that. Or if you want to do a one-time thing, buy me a coffee link. Everything is in the description. You can do it through there. And please subscribe to the channel. Again, I say this every time, but please do. It does help. The more I have, the better. Getting close to 600, and I'd like to hit that really soon. That would be a nice big boost. So if you're not following the channel or subscribing, please do. And all my social media is there as well. And like I said, I will get those blogs out that Kyle has done. Do read them. If you're, jonesing for a little more, waiting for the book, check those out because they are definitely cool and really thought-provoking. So thanks again, Kyle. The pressure has already started on you here. Unfortunately, Norma is going to jump at the bit here, but she's got good intentions. So she loves her history, so it's good. But did you enjoy the show? Did you like being on?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun. The hour went by like that.
I know it's when I first started doing this, I was like, an hour's a lot. And then every time I do it, I'm like, I blink and 45 minutes is gone. Yeah. And I haven't asked like 3 questions that I wanted to ask. So it's great. It's great to hear that you enjoyed it. Again, once that book is done and I get to get into it, we'll have you back on and really dig into it. All right. So thanks for coming on again. Everyone have a good evening, and I will see you tomorrow afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Brad.